Ohio State University, the Ohio State University, and later Brown University, and has a special interest in the work we're doing here. He'll be interviewing our guest. To introduce our guest, I've asked the chair of our Religious Studies Department to do that, Christina Bucher, a native of Lancaster County, an alumnus of Elizabethtown College, Bethany Seminary, and the Claremont Graduate School. So, Chris, would you introduce our guest?
Well, when I was growing up on a farm in southern Lancaster County, going to the Ephrata Cloister was always going up home, as my mother referred to it. And it took a number of years before I realized that my mother really never was fully transplanted to southern Lancaster County, that the Ephrata Cloister was always her home. Another thing that I realized as probably when I was in seminary, studying with Dale Brown and Don Dernbaugh, and I was studying Brethren history, I thought about the fact that my father, who grew up in the Church of the Brethren, had married my mother, Marie Bucher, Marie Kachel, and that she remained a member of the German Seventh-day Baptist group, so that in their marriage they were rejoining two groups that had separated years before. And that realization slowly came to me, although I think most of the members of the Mechanic Grove Church of the Brethren, where my mother has been an active member for many years, probably don't realize that she's not Church of the Brethren, but rather one of the German Seventh-day Baptist. She moved to southern Lancaster County in her 20s, mid-20s. Is that right?
A little bit later.
A little bit later. Taught school down there before marrying my father, Lauren Bucher, and settling on the farm. She taught school for, at the same time as she went to, attended school, getting a teaching certificate, attending Millersville, a summer at Duke, a summer here.
Yes.
When she, you stayed in the, in Alpha Hall. Didn't you have a room in Alpha Hall? So she's attended school here and also Penn State, where you have your master's degree. I've heard a lot over the years about the cloister, but I'm also looking forward to hearing what she has to say tonight.
Just a bit of the ground rules, if you would please. I've prepared a series of questions to ask Mrs. Bucher. She has seen them in advance. And at the end of the formal interview period, we'll take questions. But because, like my mother, Mrs. Bucher is hard of hearing and wears hearing aids, I'll take your question and then repeat it to her in the best way possible. So we'll work that way. Also, I just want to mention one thing briefly about my early life. In Ohio, we also have a Lancaster, except we call it Lancaster. And my father comes to visit and still can't get it. So after being here 10 years and trying to convert him, I can't do it. So welcome to Elizabethtown College here in Lancaster County. Mrs. Bucher, could you please tell us a little bit about your early life at the cloister, for example? Maybe you don't have to tell us exactly when you were born there, but tell us a bit about your birth family and how you grew up there, if you can.
Well, I was born on the property, and some people think that means in the old houses. I was born in the old farmhouse that was there, but not in the celibate houses. They assume when they say that I am the last member that somehow or other I lived as a celibate there. There were also householders. My mother was Katie Zerfus, and it was through her family that we were associated with the Seventh-day Baptists at Ephrata. The Zerfus family was for many generations, was part of the history of the cloisters. Without trying to bore you, I would say that if I went back 4 or 5 generations, the Zerfuses were always at the cloisters. The first immigrant Zerfus came over from Germany in 1740 and landed in Philadelphia. And from there, somehow or other, Nicholas Zerfus found his way over to Ephrata, which was an established place by that time. And it was natural, since it was an unpopulated area in 1740, if you can place yourself back in that era. So he landed at Ephrata, and there he met the daughter of Peter Clough, who was a householder. And Nicholas married Elizabeth, the daughter of Peter Clough. So if I go back to great-great-great-great-grandmother, she was a part of a householder's family. And incidentally, her sister was one of the celibate sisters there at the cloisters, and died at a very early age there. Nicholas came over from Germany. As I said, he landed in 1740 at the age of 20. And then he wandered inland and finally settled and started a family there. The ship that he came over in was named Samuel. And that's kind of interesting to me because he had two children, the oldest one of which was named Samuel. And Samuel had a son whose name was Samuel. And the second Samuel had a son whose name was Samuel. And that Samuel, if I talk about him, will be referred to as Samuel, who was born in 1802. He was my great-grandfather. I'm very conscious that I'm going to run into my history, which will be of no interest to many of you. So I'll look to him to be my guide.
What I'm curious. You say Nicholas in 1740 came to Philadelphia and wandered inland. Do you believe he had heard about the community and was seeking such a thing, or such a?
I would assume that he had heard of the community because I think it was Peter Miller who, and I have someone here who can verify what I say. I think it was Peter Miller who said one time that they didn't have to go to see people at the cloisters, that anybody who came from the old country to this country had heard of the cloisters and they came to the cloisters to see them. So I'm sure that it was well known. And it was close to the old city of Lancaster. And there were highways in here of the type that existed at that time. We'd hardly call them highways today, but they were main roads. The Paxton Road went right past the cloisters. The cloisters itself, and I assume that most of you know the history of the cloisters, but it's located in a piece of land was close to 200 acres that's almost a triangle. The one side is the Cocalico Creek, and the other side is bounded by 222 or 272 that runs from Lancaster to Reading, and the other side is bounded by 322 that runs from Philadelphia to Harrisburg. So it's right in that area.
Now, Chris sort of started with your young adult life in southern Lancaster, I think she described it. Could you tell us, though, a little bit about your early life in the community?
You mean as
a
I lived
child?
in the cloister?
Yes, as a child.
And my father's name was Reuben Coffle, and my mother, of course, was Katie Zerfus Coffle. We lived on one of the two farms into which the cloister property was divided. The farm that my dad farmed was known as the lower farm on the Academy farm. The other name for it, and the more usual name, was the Shady Nook farm. I have help here. We grew up in that farm. There were 6 children. Actually, there were 8. There were a pair of twin boys who died at birth. So we usually think of being 6. There was, the firstborn was a son, and that was my brother Daniel, who incidentally died just this past July at the age of 89. And he had been a part of the cloisters for many, many years, being superintendent there for quite some time. He was very much interested in the cloisters, and he would have enjoyed talking to me this evening. I was the oldest of the 5 girls. I was named for my grandmother. We were raised at the cloisters, and it was sort of a contained settlement, really. We had no need of going outside of the cloister property for playground facilities, or our own school was right there. It's not that we didn't at times go up into Ephrata, but usually there was enough going. For those of you who have lived at the cloisters, you know that there are about 11 buildings there, the little homes in which these people lived, besides the large buildings. And those buildings were all occupied all during the time that I lived there. They paid a small rent. They were people who occupied the buildings, and I don't know that anything was ever done when one person moved out and the other in, like in today's culture where you almost have to repaper and repaint. There was none of that. When they moved in, if they wanted something changed, they did it themselves. And they were a very fine group of people. But it produced, for each family, from 3 to 5 to 7 children. So we had enough of children right on the grounds that we didn't have to go anywhere else for playmates. And the summer was a long summer. There was the creek that we went swimming in practically every afternoon. There were boats. A neighbor had a boat, and he could take us boat riding on the weekend. We had a canoe. There was fishing. And then there was just rambling over the woods, and the woods was a beautiful place. When I was a sophomore in high school, I was amazed that I got about 100 exhibits of flowers just from the hillside that runs clean along the stream. I found flowers there that I never noticed before, and I needed them for my collection. There was only one that I couldn't get, and that I traded with someone from Anabaptist. They were a horsetail that I never found at the cloisters. And then we didn't have a lot of playthings. I was grown before I realized that I never had a doll as a child. And I didn't miss it, in the fact that when you were up, there were playmates there. At a certain age, I was always in the baseball team. We didn't have enough for 2 sides, but I don't know what you call that kind of baseball where you advance. If you made it out at the batting, you went out into the outfield. Just, no team, you went out. And then the catcher came up and was the batter. I see you shaking your head, so somebody wants to play that game.
Roundup, we called it. I think it was called a roundup.
What's called?
Roundup.
Roundup.
Or something like that.
Yes. Well, we had teams there that we played almost every night, and the days were long, swimming in the evening, and of course we had chores. The older we grew, the more chores, of course, we had. If we didn't have anything to do, there was a rail fence that ran along the lane. And we'd take the lower rail out of that fence, and that provided a seesaw. Or we'd use a hoop and run the hoop over the roads and see who could go fastest. And if that wasn't enough, we had 2 white mules that my brother and I would use to pick cherries. In trees that we couldn't climb, we'd just get on the horses or the mules and ride out underneath, particularly a black cherry tree that had such a huge trunk that there was no way you could crawl up the trunk, So we just went out on the mules and picked the cherries from the mules. The place was full of trees. As for those of you who know the history, know that they purposely planted a lot of trees, because to the inhabitants, I'm talking about the early inhabitants of 1740 and thereabouts. They needed to have fruits so that they could preserve them, so that they could have food for winter. And of course, that part is a whole different story as to how they had lived through a winter. Remembering that there was very little transportation at 1740, there was no way, there were no stores or no shopping centers like we have today. The roads were not what they are today. So they were isolated, and if you didn't prepare for the winter, I'm talking about the 1740 era now, you simply didn't have any food. Coming back to my own period, I was born in 1909, and that makes me 88 years old. I just had a birthday in November. So that goes back a little bit further, I think, than anybody else in the room. I guess I went out on that one. At that time, it was necessary to prepare, and oftentimes we would dry food. We would dry apples. And I started to say that because of a need for fruits in their diet, many orchards were planted on the property. And many of those trees existed for years and years, so that we had pear trees of all kinds, apple trees, all during the season of different varieties, starting with the smokehouse and what other kinds we had. We just ate the apples. One was a little apple that was called a honey apple, and one was a little pear that was called a honey pear. So they kept us busy all, and we took advantage of them. So the days were long. There just, with all those people present, there just was no excuse to sit down and cry that you had no playmates or had nothing to do. It was always something to do. And as I grew up then, of course, we helped with the farm work. I was reminded the other day as I passed a field where a big monster machine was going through that in a cornfield. And this machine, as you know, cuts the stalk off, and it husks the corn, and it shells the corn, all in one operation out in the field. Well, when I was a kid, it was a different story. First, my parents had to go out and cut the stalks off, and then they put them in teepees or bunch them together. And then some nice cold morning, they went out and sat on one of the bunches and husked the corn and threw the corn over in a pile. And then after we came home from school, Dan and I would hitch up a team and that had a wagon that had sides on it, go up, and we picked the corn up. We were too small to at that time use a bushel basket to advantage. We couldn't have lifted it. So we just threw the corn on the wagon, and then finally the wagon got back to the barn, and then we threw it off into the corn crib. All of that operation, when now just a machine goes through and the corn is all collected all at one time in grains. It was a marvelous period through which we grew, and my brother and I oftentimes talked about this, that he was 89, as I said, and I am 88. So we've lived through a period that has had such a tremendous change. And some of you have seen part of that change, maybe not 80 years of it, but part of it. My father never had a tractor. All the work that was done in the farm was done by muscles of man and animal. He had an early Model T Ford almost as soon as they came out, because he liked to have horses and teams. He was known to have, while he was single, to have a very nice team with 2 horses. But so far as the farm is concerned, if you went to our house, there just was no central heating. There was no plumbing. We didn't even have an ice box. And I think all of you know what an ice box was, a place where you bought a big slab of ice. He would come around and you bought from him the ice. You didn't have to go to the store for it. And you would put that into a big box at the top, and it kept the lower part cold enough that your vegetables or your food wouldn't spoil unless you kept it there too long. The only part about our ice box was the ice melted, and there's a tube that took the water down to the floor, and you put a pan down there, but you know you forgot about the pan. Next thing you know, you had a whole little bunch of water, a little lake surrounding the ice box. But when you think about it, the home was very spare, and yet we didn't think of being neglected. We didn't even think we were poor, but we were. But most people were like that. This is before the Depression. And so we had a full life, and we had enough to eat. But my brother often remembers that our orange that we sold on Christmas, we got an orange from our Sabbath school, Anabaptist County. And that was the only time in the year that you saw oranges. There weren't. If I were to describe the first store, and I think some of you remember that first store that was up in Main Street. Miller's had it, right below the blacksmith shop. And they just converted the front room of their home into a store. Now, if you can imagine, as you go to Park City, one store in one room. But of course, what they sold was sugar and flour. Maybe they had bread, not always, because you always had a bread man that came around in a team. And you also had a man that came around with meat, and one that came around with fruit. So you didn't expect to find bananas there, and of course oranges weren't there either. You got sugar and flour, and you didn't go around and collect them. You told the person who served you what you wanted, and you said you'd like to have a pound of crackers, so they went over and weighed out a pound of crackers from the barrel, brought the bag back on the counter and folded the top over, and then up in the top of the ceiling, you remember that little cage with a round ball of string that came down through the cage, so they pulled that string down, wrapped the bag for you, and then place it aside ready for your basket. And then they had a little tablet, no computer, and then they wrote out 1 pound of crackers, so much. If you wanted molasses, they had that. And if you wanted molasses, they went out back. There was a barrel with a pump on it, and they would pump out the quart jar that you brought along and filled it up. And incidentally, sometimes we had extra eggs, so we would take the eggs along to the store, and they would pay us a little bit for the eggs and sell the eggs to someone else and take that amount off our bill. But if you can imagine, that was the world that you lived in. A far cry from it was 80 years after that. You go to Park City and you just stop and think of that little store, you know. Now, we did have a bigger store in Ephrata, but that was near the square, and that was a little far to walk. And that square, and that store, and I can't remember the name of it right now, had a grocery in the back, and the shoe department was right next, in front of there, and then there was a clothing department. Whatever you wanted, you could buy in that store, and it wasn't about as big as 2 first floors of a house, I'd say. No Park City. And they sold you everything that you needed.
You mentioned getting a box of chocolates and an orange at Christmas time. What do you remember of holiday traditions? Holiday traditions at the cloister?
Holidays, there really wasn't very much to holidays in my life. The church, the Seventh-day Baptist Church, and we went there to Sabbath school, and they provided the orange and the candy. but I don't remember that the children ever put programs on. Number one, it was a small group of people. And number two, churches didn't do that, at least not the Anabaptist churches. You know, the Seventh-day Baptist Church was an outbreak of the Church of the Brethren. It started with Conrad Beisel, and he was a minister in the Church of the Brethren. So that the church at Ephrata is basically a brethren church. Beisel had three differences. I ramble a little bit.
It's okay. It's okay.
Beisel had three differences with the Brethren Church that they couldn't adopt. One was communal living. And the Brethren had tried communal living in the old country, and it just didn't work for them. And so they wanted nothing to do with Beisel's idea of communal living. Secondly, he believed in celibacy. He believed that the end of the world was close by, and that to be married, you had to give too much of your time up to your family. And he believed that he wanted to be a hermit. He wanted to have his whole time just for admiration and worship of the Lord. And he felt that as a married person, you couldn't give that full devotion. Besides, as I studied, I realized that even in medieval times, a single life was a little bit, considered a little bit above the married state. Whether that had anything to do with Beisel, I don't know. We'll have to wait for Jeff Bach to explain that to us.
But no pageants, you said, in the school. How about anything that we would recognize today from, say, Christmas or other holiday traditions?
At home, there was very little. I don't remember anything in Sabbath school, and we never had programs in the church. For those of you who are familiar with the Brethren Church, it just wasn't done. I think this is true for most Anabaptist churches. Church was church. Even Sunday school was something that was argued and discussed for many, many years before the Brethren Church would allow a church to have a Sunday school. So if you can't have a Sunday school, you can imagine they wouldn't put on plays and pageants. And of course, no musical instruments in our... I'd like to tell you about how I felt about going to church. And I know I'm jumping around here quite a lot. Let me finish first about the holidays. So the holidays, so far as the church was concerned, you wouldn't have known that Christmas was coming. But in our own home, we always had a Christmas tree. We had a nice dinner. It wasn't turkey, but it was always chicken because we raised our own chickens. And we had a nice Christmas meal, but there were no presents. On Easter, we had an Easter basket at home, but there was nothing in church. The sermon could have been on an Easter theme, but there were no programs as such. And let me tell you a little bit. We worshipped in the Saul, and for those of you that visit the cloisters, remember the Saul. It was lighted by hanging lamps at my time, called kerosene lamps. And as we rounded the corner, as we walked through the meadow on a Friday night, just as the sun was setting, we saw the lighted windows of the church. And there was only one door. And there are reasons for that, which I don't think we want to go into now. Everybody went through that front door, not two doors like most Brethren churches of that era. And the men walked to the right and sat on the right side of the church, and the women and her children, excepting the grown boys, sat on the left side. And then there was a wide aisle between the two. And the pulpit then was at the far point of the aisle, so that the congregation looked at each other and did not face the minister, that it was a church of a community. It was a communal church. And this, of course, is true for the brethren churches as well. We walked in and we sat down, and we would have the usual service of prayer and songs. And the music that we had used was always a cappella. As far as I know, there was not a musical instrument in the soul until the state had programs in it. But up until that time, with one exception, there was a marriage that the man almost demanded that they have some kind of a small musical instrument there. But with that exception, there was never any music in the soul. After the last song, we moved out into the darkness of the night and went home. Our communion service was held there also. And incidentally, we have communion services even today, which are held twice a year. But the communal, the services that I attended, again, you walked over to a lighted room, and when you walked in this kerosene light, which is rather dim, and seems to me has many shadows. But anyway, you walked into that, and the tables were set, and usually you had a very simple meal. It was not to be a full meal. It was to be a friendship meal. And sometimes we had a beef barley soup. My brother remembers that, and I don't remember the soup, but I do know that we would have plates of meat and some cubed cheese and some homemade bread and butter and apple butter. And we always had pies. My mother was the pie baker, and she was a marvelous pie baker. And in spring, we would have Sitz pie or the ever-ready raisin pie. You know, we didn't have access to a lot of things. In the fall, we'd have the apple pie and the raisin pie. So that was our agape meal. Following the agape meal was the feet washing program, and they used the single form of feet washing where, and we do that today, where one person washes the feet of the person next to them, and then rising from their knees and the washing of their feet, there's a hand clasp and a holy kiss. And then the apron that you used was passed on to the second person that was sitting alongside of you, whose feet were just washed. And then that person washed the feet of the next person. Now the double method, which caused a lot of controversy in the church, was where two, perhaps deacons, for the women it was two of the wives of the deacons, who would wash the feet of a number of people. And I think maybe that might have come from the idea, as the Bible tells it, where Christ washed all the feet of the disciples. I don't know how that arose, but I know it caused a lot of controversy in the churches. And the first time that I remember of having that occur was when we went out to Snow Hill, and we were there at communion time, and they used the double method there. After the feet washing, then of course is the bread and the wine, and after that a song, and then you leave quietly and go out into the dark. Our Sabbath school was not too much different from our Sabbath school today, but incidentally, both the Brethren and the Seventh-day Baptist had a Sabbath school long before Robert Raikes, who was supposed to have had the first Sunday school in London. They had a Sabbath school at Ephrata and also at Germantown way before that time. And it was a gathering of the young people, and we were taught the Bible, sang songs, and that was held on Sabbath morning. Our church service was Friday night at sunset. That takes me to the school. The school, I like to talk about this because something very interesting happened, and I only found out it after I was grown. I knew that my mother attended the academy school, which you people have seen if you visited the cloisters. That's a lovely white building, which doesn't look at all like a cloister building. It's no log building. This was known as the academy and was built much later in 1836. It was there that I attended school, as did all my sisters and my brother, excepting the youngest sister, Ruth, who was born a little bit too late for that. The school at that time, the whole school system was changed. The academy at that time was rented by the township, and the township at that time decided to bus its children, and my youngest sister went to first grade up at Lincoln in a graded school. But we went to the academy where all 8 grades were in one room, and Miss Annie Moeller, was the teacher. We never knew her last name. She was always known as Miss Annie. And she had 60 students, from 50 to 60. And she taught them in all grades. It's unbelievable. How many went to a rural school? I really want to know. Well, then I don't have to describe that rural school, because it was something. You were everything to everybody. You swept the floors. You saw that the boards on which the children worked were washed. The erasers were clapped. If you didn't see that someone did it, you did it yourself, or had to do it yourself. If someone hurt themselves out in the playground, you were the nurse. You were supposed to keep order on the playground, so you were the playground supervisor. And then you taught. So it was an interesting situation. And to me, it is marvelous that so many wonderful people came out of such a school system. We talk about individual attention, and I just read in last night's paper about the school that's closing here in Lancaster County, where there's a one-to-one relationship between teacher and pupil. Just imagine one teacher to every pupil as compared to one teacher to 60 pupils. There was no way you could do justice. And to think that such marvelous and wonderful people have come out of that school system. Well, what surprised me was the fact that I knew my mother attended the academy, and I knew my uncle, Uncle Sam, who was also the minister there, attended the academy, and it was also a teacher there in later years. What I didn't know was all her siblings, all 4 of them, attended the academy. And not only that, but that my mother's father, who was one of 5 children, they all attended the academy. Now that goes back to J.J. Zerfus. And then his father was Samuel Zerfus, who was born in 1802. His children all attended that. I think, I don't know how I would have felt sitting in that little seat there in the school had I known not only did my mother attend, but my grandfather, my great-grandfather. It was a wonderful discovery. You had a blackboard and a piece of chalk and an eraser, and that was your visual aids. I can't think of maybe a picture of the president, if you counted that a visual aid.
You talked about the celibate community being so important to Conrad Weissel. What are your remembrances of the celibate community, and what happened to the celibate community in your opinion?
Well, the last celibate died in 1813. Now after that, there were sometimes maiden ladies who moved into the empty buildings, or sometimes widows. This was a period again where there was no Social Security, and as a widow, on unless you had made a lot of money in your life, what you had at the death of your husband was all you had for the rest of your life. And you didn't spend it carelessly. And many times it wasn't enough to keep you that long. So you either had to live with your family, but if you had no family, the church allowed those people to come back and live in parts of the sister's house and part of the upper floors of the church. So even my mother knew nothing of the celibate sisters, but she did know of a sister Hannah, who incidentally was her aunt, who lived in the building, and many other people. And of course the church then furnished a certain amount of food. And at that time, if you furnished flour and some kind of shortening and a few things like that, that was all that was necessary. I think my mother could have kept her family on flour and shortening for a whole week, and we would have been satisfied. She made the marvelous biscuits. You know, we had an old wood stove, and that was a marvel. That old wood stove had 6 plates on the top. It had an oven that was ever ready. It was always, except in summertime, it was always heated, ready for the cake or pie that you wanted to bake. And she baked many of them, and many biscuits that she baked there. Then on the end, it had a great big tank, and that was filled with water, so you always had hot water. You had no running water, but you had this hot water there. So as far as the celibate sisters, that was long since past. And what I know of them, I know through history.
Okay. Well, did you feel a continuity with the earlier traditions of the cloister, and how did the later generations learn about the cloister? Was that a formal thing taught in the school, or passed down oral tradition?
You know, I forgot to tell you that there was no running water in our home. There was no central heat. There was no refrigeration. There was no telephone. There was no radio. There was no TV. And somehow or other we did without a computer. In such a setup, you know, what do you do in the evenings but you talk to each other? And so we did learn from our parents about our grandparents, and if we're very inquisitive, why, they would tell us the whole story. And sometimes if we were not inquisitive and didn't care really to hear about it, we heard about it anyway. So we heard about the church, and we heard about Conrad Beisel, and later on, of course, we read histories of Beisel and the church.
How much interaction would you say you had with the surrounding community? You mentioned shopping, going to shop, etc. Were there lots of opportunities to interact with the surrounding community?
Well, in 1914 would be I would begin to remember things in 1914. We, of course, shopped in Ephrata. Eventually I went to the Ephrata High School. And of course mingled with people there.
I see.
We didn't, our family didn't belong to lodges because that was not permitted by the church. We were accepted by the people. That it's a little bit difficult. People in Ephrata never came down to the cloisters. In the early years, history was not altogether that important. There was very little tourism as we have it today. People didn't go and visit places. As a kid growing up, we were lucky if we had 2 or 3 groups, 2 or 3 visitors during a week. Mainly sometimes it was just one. And then it was, the people came from Galen Hall, which was a summer resort. And they, for entertainment of their guests, would send them over to the cloisters. And they would drive in these great big black cars, which was, you know, an eye-opener for Wheeler country children. We sort of played a game with them one time. We had gates that allowed you to come into our lane, and they, at that time, would come into our lane past our house and park up under the walnut trees. Well, we found by accident that if we hurried out and opened the gate for this chauffeur, we would usually get a tip. And so we worked that game. There were a gate at one end and a gate at the other end, because we had to keep the cows enclosed in order to water them. And so we saw that the gates were both closed, but we were there to open them. Either my brother opened the first one and I the second, or vice versa, wherever we were. So, coming back to the main question of how we were accepted by the community sometimes never visited the cloisters unless they got some company from Ohio, Indiana, and the company came in and said, we heard so much about the cloisters, we'd like to go down and see them. So they would bring them down to see the cloisters, and that would be the first time that they ever visited there. The town really didn't appreciate the cloisters, but I must say that history wasn't appreciated at that time like it is today.
Was there anything that marked you? You said you went to high school in Ephrata. Was there anything that you remember as being very different about how you looked or acted compared to the students?
Exactly,
yes, the students that were not did not live on the cloister.
Not really, no.
You bought clothes from the same store, I guess.
What's that?
You bought clothes from the same store, so maybe you looked the same, or did you look different in your style of dress, or? Yes, did you look different in your style of dress, or?
Oh, no, the church at Ephrata was not a so-called plain church. No, we didn't dress any different. We dressed poorly because we didn't have any money, but we didn't dress differently. And we were accepted, I think. I was a very shy person, so I had my own problems in that sense. Shy because at the end of the 4th grade at the academy, they moved us up to Lincoln. And there was no busing. We walked up to Lincoln and we went up on our own accord because Lincoln had 2 teachers there and we needed to be prepared for high school. We took an examination at the end of 8th grade in order to get into high school. And it was almost asking too much of Miss Annie to prepare us for that situation. So we were sent to Lincoln, where we had a teacher who had just 4 grades, and the teacher there was my Uncle Sam. So we went there for 4 years. But by the time I got to Lincoln, I didn't feel at home because these people had already formed all their groups, you know. And then by the time I got to Ephrata, I was in a new situation again, because none of the ones that took the exam, excepting myself, passed that year. So I was a loner again. And my high school years were not that pleasant. I had a much better time in college than I did in high school. But it wasn't because we were different. Everybody knew that we worshiped on Saturday, and sometimes they would ask me to explain this. And I soon found out that I better get a good answer for it. Because there was a David Solidor in class, a Jewish boy, and he was quite inquisitive of why we, a Protestant group, worshipped on Saturday.
Well, we've been here about an hour. Perhaps we should take questions now. I think it's interesting, though, that Governor Ridge thinks he's so innovative with this school testing, and it seems like Ephrata was maybe 80 years ahead of themselves. Dave?
You said there were 3 reasons that Beisel broke with the Brethren, and you got 2 of them, I think. One was the...
Scatterbrain.
No, remind me what the 2 were.
No. The one was celibacy, which I mentioned. The other was communal living. And the third one was the Sabbath.
The Sabbath.
This was one of Bison's first, I guess, first differences really was he felt that that the Saturday or the seventh day was the day of worship rather than the first day. And he kept the Sabbath himself as a preacher in the Brethren Church at Conestoga. And he didn't require the people to follow him. But he'd come to a point that they knew he wanted to worship on Saturday. And then the other differences occurred. And it was just too different. So he sort of organized the church at Conestoga, and he walked out and walked away through the woods and the streams, and he followed one stream, and that was the Cocalico, and finally he found a meadow that had a spring in it, and that was an ideal place to stop. You had water, you had a stream for when there were few roads for traveling, and the land was nice. The land had walnut trees on it, and someone one time told me that if a German found that a land had walnut trees on it, he knew it was a good farmland. And we certainly had plenty of walnut trees around the cloisters.
Tell us about your baptism, or how old were people when they were baptized, or how did that all work? Was there a certain age, or?
Now, you're talking about baptism.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be sure that I heard your question correct. I was baptized when I was about 12. The church at Ephrata, the Seventh-day Baptist Church, the German Seventh-day Baptist Church, was almost basically the same as the German Brethren Church, the German Baptist Brethren. We were Anabaptists, so we were baptized at a knowledgeable age. Now, I was baptized at 12, my brother was 13, and when we were baptized, I only found out later on that my uncle, who was a very heavy person and had difficulty walking, as far as I can remember, he always used a cane. And he didn't baptize in the Cocalico. If we were to be baptized, we were taken out to Bedford or Franklin County, which had daughter churches out there, Seventh-day Baptists. And I was baptized in moving water, in running water, 3 times forward, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, Holy Spirit, which is identical to the Brethren baptism.
Did your parents speak Pennsylvania Dutch?
Did your parents speak Pennsylvania Dutch?
Yes, they did. They did, and I'll never excuse them for this. They talked German, particularly when they didn't want us to hear. They never talked German to us, and we were never expected to talk German. So I never learned to talk German, although I learned to understand most of it. They didn't pull the wool over my eyes there. I learned to understand it, but the tough part about it was finally I went to Millersville and got 2 years of training, which gave you a certificate to teach in grade school. And so about the year I was 20, I started teaching in a rural school in northern Clay Township. And sure enough, I got one beginner that couldn't talk English. And I couldn't talk the German, even though I understood her. The problem was I was to teach her English, not German. So, and many times, even now, I wish I could talk Pennsylvania Dutch. I have an accent, but I can't talk it.
How many members were in the congregation at the time that you were living at the property? Bob, you might have to let her know that.
How many members were living or were in the congregation at the time you were living in the property?
Well, at a certain period, I think they had 50, and then it dwindled down. And In fact, they had to change the number of trustees because they didn't have enough. It originally should have had 7 trustees to take care of the business. Let me go back a little bit. When the sisterhood died out in about 1813, then the married group came in and took the property over, and it was so organized that they had 7 trustees to take care of the business. But as time went on, the number of people that worshiped there dwindled to the point that they couldn't get 7 anymore, so it was reduced to 3 trustees. And at the time that the state took it over, there were 11 members.
That relates to one of my questions. You said there were people living on the grounds there in the householder homes. Were those members of the German Seventh-day Baptist group?
Most of them were not.
Were not. And what about you said there were sisters or widows who lived in the buildings? Would they have been members of the church?
Yes. I better not say yes so quickly. There might have been 1 or 2 that were not members, but usually they were the widows of former, and they were members of the church. As a rule, most of them were members of the church.
Administrative point, should I flip this thing?
Well, in the early years, were there both the celibates and the householders, or did the householders only come later?
In the early years, were there both celibates and householders, or did the householders come later?
So many people that visit the cloisters think that they came as a group, which is not the case. As I sort of hinted before, Beisel found this place and lived there. There was one other person, an Eckerling, I believe, that lived in a house, and he moved in, but in spring, they built Beisel his own house. And then people from Conestoga that were enamored. Beisel was supposed to have been a very charismatic person, and he had people that followed him. In fact, he built up the church in that way. And they would come in and they would build a little cabin for them. Finally, 2 sisters came in, and Mariah and Anna Eichel asked to be admitted. And they debated this a long time because this group of this settlement, with these peculiar ideas of celibacy and nonviolence, they were a peace church. They would not go to war. This was looked upon by the neighbors, the few neighbors that were scattered in the area, was looked upon with suspicion. And so when these 2 girls came, they debated this quite a long time to find out whether they should allow this, because this would just be a lot of more gossip. And so finally they settled it by admitting them, but they built their cabin on the other side of the stream. So they were on opposite side of the Cocalico Creek. And then after many of these little buildings were built, somebody got the idea that they would live as a group. And so the single sisters began, there was a building built, and the building was built for something else, but eventually it became the sisters' house. And they moved into that long house. And then there was a brother's house built about 5 years later. And each one had their own church and their own soul. Now the brother's house has long since disappeared, but the sister's house still stands with its soul and church. Now I don't know if that quite answered your
Yes,
question.
that answered it.
What was the largest number of worshipers? At its peak, at its height, what was the largest number in the congregation?
How many people?
Yeah,
I think about 1750 or 60 along, they had about 50 brothers and 50 sisters. But then there were householders. Now the householders did not live on the cloister land. They usually lived outside on farms. and usually at a distance that they can come back and have church. Some people say in a radius of about 5 miles. So the householders eventually were larger in number than the celibates. And I would think maybe 200. Mike, help me out with that.
Right on.
As most of you know, Mike is working at the cloisters. He's the educator of the cloister complex, and he does a very good job.
How many members are there now? Are there members still at Snow Hill or in Western?
How many members at the
Do you-
cloisters?
No, how many members in the church besides yourself? How many members in the German Seventh-day Baptist Church
Today?
today?
I don't know. I can't answer that, Chris. Maybe Mike can help me out. We have an English Seventh-day Baptist. We have the German Seventh-day Baptist. And there are 2 daughter churches out in Bedford and Franklin County. One at a place called Nunnery near Quincy and at Enterprise. Both of those churches are smaller, getting smaller.
About 15 at Snow Hill and about 100 at New Enterprise.
But there is an English Seventh-day Baptist
New
church that is, I think, a little bit more alive than the German part.
Were the assets of the householders, did that belong to the community, or could householders have their own?
They had their own places, and some of them actually had very nice homes and quite large places. And large families. So if you had the Konigmachers or a family like that, you didn't have one, but you had a whole bunch of them.
Well, you said there were no computers, so
What's that?
there were no computers, so they needed to be something else.
To your knowledge, were the householders ever expected to be celibate even though they were married?
Yes, yes.
And when did that change? Apparently it did.
There was a time when they thought that there was only one reason for that creation was the only reason, and that they should be should abstain. And there came a time when, I think through Breisel's influence, there were a number of householders who decided that they would go celibate. And they moved, and the sister's house, I mentioned that before, and I wasn't going to go into that, but it's an interesting part of the story. And the sisters moved in one half of what is now the sister's house, or Sarah, and the men moved in the other half. And you can see in the arrangement of the building, there are 2 entrances there, and 2 fireplaces in the kitchen. So it was made for 2 different groups. Now the children that they had stayed out on the farms, and one wonders how they were taken care of. But you also can see that the mothers were concerned about this as well as the fathers. And this finally just didn't work. And so they were giving bills of divorcement by Beisel, and those were all burned up, and they went back to their farms.
Do you know of any reason why instrumental music was frowned upon by the church?
Yeah, you know.
Yes. Do you know of any reason why instrumental music was frowned upon by the church?
I just recently finished the history for the Brethren Church at Mechanic Grove. And in going over that history, which is the same thought, they objected to musical instruments because, first of all, are there any Brethren people here?
You want a confession?
said that you couldn't do something, then that was that. And when you went and asked whether you could have a piano in the church, and the meeting said, well, the Bible doesn't say anywhere that you can have a piano in the church. So the answer is no. Well then, and this happened with all the things that they wanted. And then maybe a couple of years, or maybe the following year, the same question would come up to, again, the yearly meeting. And then they would say, well, we would rather you didn't do this. And then finally, in a few years later, it would come up again. They said, well, the Bible doesn't say anything about a piano, so yes, you can have it, but do it with discretion. Now, that doesn't quite answer your question. If you go back into the Old Testament, there was a family that Chris, maybe you will help me out. They were known for their symbols. They were
In Genesis? Back in Genesis?
in the Old Testament.
But is it in Genesis?
Yes.
Tubal Cain?
Yes. And they went back. Now, that wasn't a plan that was accepted. And they said, well, that was one reason. And then another reason was that if you were to have a musical instrument, God would have made man so that he could produce musical instruments. And I came across those two ideas. There's one other, and right now I can't place my fingers on it. Maybe someone can help me about that. There was another reason for not having musical instruments. But I think mainly it was, well, the Bible didn't give you permission. But it was so nice, you know, the way they turned it around eventually after it was asked again and again, and they said, well, now the Bible doesn't say you can't have it, so use it with discretion. I'm sure there's someone here that knows another reason for that. Mike?
Probably were historical reasons. I mean, the Pietists in general were objected to instrumental music, sort of a socio thing. The Reformed did it, the Lutheran did it, it must be wrong. Not the reason.
At your communion service, was wine made with, or having alcohol used, or was it a fruit juice?
My uncle, I remember this rather distinctly. My Uncle Sam said, and we disagreed with the brethren here, that if you were drinking the wine as the blood of Christ, it should have spirit in it. In the Brethren Church, it's grape juice.
And was the wine produced on the in the cloister property?
On the cloister property?
Yes.
I'm afraid I can't answer that. I doubt it very much, because I don't remember any grapevines on the property. And I would have remembered them because we would have given them a trial as kids.
So it would have been purchased outside the community?
I think so. I must have been there. But he thought that it had to have spirit in it, and that grape juice didn't answer the purpose.
The German Baptists had spirit in their communion wine up until the 20th century.
He said the German Baptists had wine in their services up until the 20th century.
Is that, I didn't know that.
Well, they still do. The old German Baptists still do.
Yeah.
Another question, what language did you use in the church services?
In the church.
In your childhood?
English.
It was all English. What hymnal did you use?
There were many families that didn't talk English that, after I got to teaching, I found that a lot of families, particularly in the Amish or very conservative Mennonites, did not teach their children English. But in our home, I think my uncle could speak German, but I don't remember him ever having a German sermon. Incidentally, our songbooks are just a little, about 4 inches by 6 inches. I have 2 from the cloisters that my mother gave me. You sort of had your individual songbooks. Anyway, half of the book has the psalms or the songs in German, and the second half have them in English. And of course, there are no musical notes. You had another book, the sisters had another book with the musical notes in, and then the words were over here, but the two were not combined. In my experience, the person who led the song would tell what tune that the hymn was to be sung by. Sometimes some hymns had 2 different tunes or more, and you sang the song according to the leader. But they introduced the tune, or maybe even sang the song, and then the group followed after them. But the music was not in the songbook itself.
Were any of the brothers or sisters doing fraktur while you were there, while you lived on the cloister
Were
grounds?
there any of the...
Doing fraktur, doing the artistic...
No, no.
And the printing and all that was already stopped?
That had all, yes. By 1909, when I was born, that was all gone. Of course, our point is not the history of the cloisters, but they were outstanding for their fraktur work and their printing, as well as the music that they produced. It was an outstanding community in its period, and as Peter Miller said, anybody of consequences that came to this country or lived in this country would always make a point of visiting the cloisters.
That's probably a good point on which we can close our meeting tonight. You can stay around and visit. We do have refreshments. And again, thank you very much for coming. And thank you, Mrs. Bucher, for sharing with us.
Don't realize how much people
Still very alive.